No one expected that amid the thunder of artillery, the metallic echoes, and the endless roar of engines, there would still be room for something resembling compassion. The spring of 1943, on one of the small Pacific islands, brought not only unbearable heat and humidity, but also brutal fighting for a piece of land few American soldiers had ever heard of before. Behind code names and strategic operations, everything came down to a simple truth: survive and follow orders. Yet war, as always, broke more than bones. It fractured beliefs. As U.S. troops pushed through the jungle and coral ridges, they met fierce resistance. The enemy fought to the last bullet, appearing fanatical, almost inhuman. Newspapers back home wrote about barbarity, fanaticism, and the absence of mercy. But the men on the ground saw something else. They saw faces, bleeding, terrified, and human. Among the fallen were both friend and foe. When the smoke cleared after one assault, the battlefield fell silent. Only faint moans broke the stillness. Armed soldiers moved cautiously among the bodies, trying to tell who was still alive. Mixed with their own were the wounded enemy's young, exhausted men whose faces showed the same pain. Medics, trained to work beyond exhaustion, helped anyone they could as long as there were bandages and morphine left. One Army doctor later wrote that day he finally understood how fragile the line between us and them truly was. A captured enemy soldier was dragged to him with a severe leg wound. The bleeding was critical, the man already in shock. The only chance to save him was a quick tourniquet and pain relief. Every American soldier carried a small medical pouch, meant for self-aid. To use it on an enemy meant giving up your own last reserve, but the decision came instantly. The doctor's hands trembled as he applied the dressing, an action no one would call heroic. No one expected thanks. No report mentioned it. It was simply one human helping another because pain and blood had no nationality. At that moment, the soldiers around realized the obvious. On both sides were the same kind of boys, one from Iowa, another from a Japanese fishing village, each thinking about home, about family, about what might come after all this ended. Later, in field hospitals, these stories surfaced in letters that military censors often blocked. They weren't sentimental, nor self-pitying, just plain lines noting that the enemy screamed in pain the same way that in his eyes there was no hatred when he was dying. Such stories rarely reached the public. They blurred the simple wartime narrative of good versus evil. On the Pacific Islands, wounded enemies were often left behind not from cruelty, but from fear. Soldiers had learned to expect traps, hidden grenades, feigned wounds. Yet even then, some Americans risked crawling toward the cries for help spoken in another language, cautiously at first, checking for weapons, then with growing determination. Once the danger was clear, they bandaged wounds and gave water, using up what little supplies they had. Archival footage, shot by Army cameramen, captured some of those moments. Medics, with red crosses on their helmets, kneeling over a wounded enemy, cutting open the torn uniform, cleaning the wound, wrapping it with their own field dressings. Everything was done by the book: stop bleeding, disinfect, record data, report to command. But no manual required such humanity. It came from instinct, from the part of a man that war had not yet burned away. The paradox of those acts was that no one could expect mercy in return. The enemy might have done otherwise, and many new stories where captured Americans received no aid. Yet that did not stop them. Perhaps, deep down, they hoped that somewhere, somehow, their compassion would echo back, that one day someone might show the same mercy to one of their own. Every decision in war came down to seconds. When a bullet could find you at any moment, there was no time for moral debate. A man simply acted as his conscience dictated. Sometimes, that was what separated those who remained human from those who lost themselves entirely to hate. Veterans later described the same sensations: the smell of iodine and blood, the heavy breathing, the sticky warmth of gauze pressed against a wound. And beside them, an enemy who was no longer an enemy, just a wounded man in pain. These moments seldom made it into official history, yet they stayed engraved in memory more deeply than any medal or victory. No strategic report, no capture of a hill left as strong a mark as the moment a soldier handed his last bandage to someone who once tried to kill him. In war, few acts were not ordered. That made these gestures all the more valuable, not for glory, not for records, but for remembrance. Because, in the end, they proved that even in the heart of destruction, a fragment of light could still survive. We could hardly believe that compassion could exist among the rubble of European cities. By late 1944, the war had turned into a vast machine grinding down everything in its path. Men, cities, memories. The Allied advance from Normandy to the heart of Germany left behind a trail of shattered villages, burned-out fields, and hospitals overflowing beyond capacity. Yet even amid that devastation, moments appeared that defied the logic of total war. The American infantrymen, who had survived the landings and the months of fighting across France, had seen too much to hold on to illusions. They had lost friends, endured hunger and rain, marched through mud, and witnessed the dark side of humanity too often to believe in simple heroism. But even then, there were lines they refused to cross. When the fighting reached Belgium and the forests of the Ardennes, the cold became a new enemy. The snow hid the wounded, their cries muffled under the drifts. Patrols moved through the silence, and sometimes they stumbled upon the aftermath of battle. Broken equipment, shell craters, the stillness of men who would never move again. Among them, occasionally, one still breathed, and it did not matter what uniform he wore. American medics, burdened with stretchers and small medical kits, were trained to follow the Geneva Conventions, but reality often went far beyond rules. The official guidelines said that enemy wounded should receive aid when possible, but when possible meant risking one's life crawling under fire, exposing oneself to snipers, or giving away one's position. Still, many did it without hesitation. Eyewitness reports describe how, during the winter battles, American soldiers shared morphine syrettes and bandages with captured German soldiers. The logic was simple and cruelly practical. A wounded man could not fight anymore, and saving him was at least a way to preserve life amid senseless destruction. But there was also something deeper, a silent recognition that suffering was universal. One photograph taken near Bastogne shows a scene that history books rarely highlight. An American field medic kneels in the snow, his gloved hands pressed to a wound on a German soldier's chest. The German's helmet lies nearby, half covered by frost. Around them, ruins of a farmhouse, a broken wagon, and silence. There are no smiles, no words. Just the mechanical act of saving a life, as if the medic's body moved on instinct. In later interviews, veterans spoke about the strange calm of those moments. "You stop thinking about the uniform," one said decades later. "You just see a man who's dying, and you do what you can." It wasn't heroism. It was something closer to duty. Not the duty of a soldier, but of a human being. Among the ruins of small French towns, the same pattern repeated. Civilians, terrified and hungry, often brought wounded German soldiers to American aid stations. The medics rarely refused them. There were protocols, of course, security checks, language barriers, but the bandages were applied, the plasma administered, and the morphine given without discrimination. The Red Cross flags fluttered over the tents, symbols of neutrality that even the chaos of battle sometimes respected. The paradox of compassion during war fascinated historians long after the guns fell silent. In many official documents, these acts appear only as footnotes, if they appear at all. The focus of history tends to drift toward strategy, victories, and losses, not toward quiet, unrecorded moments of decency. Yet for those who were there, those were the moments that defined their humanity. In one documented case, From late 1944, a U.S. unit moving through the Hurtgen Forest found several wounded enemy soldiers left behind after a failed counterattack. The Americans could have ignored them. They had orders to advance, and supplies were running low. Instead, they stopped. The medics dressed wounds using their own scarce field kits, carried the men to shelter, and even shared rations. It delayed the advance, drew criticism from higher command, but saved lives. None of the rescued men ever fought again. When questioned about it years later, one of the officers said simply, "We were tired of death." Those words summarized the emotional fatigue that had settled over countless men who had seen too much killing. They no longer sought vengeance or victory in the abstract. They sought balance, a brief reminder that mercy was still possible. The winter of 1944-45 was the harshest of the European campaign. Frostbite, disease, and exhaustion killed almost as many as weapons did. In such conditions, even small acts, a sip of water given to an enemy, a shared blanket, a bandaged wound, took on immense moral weight. Some soldiers later admitted they did it not out of compassion but out of self-preservation, as if helping another man somehow pushed back the darkness creeping inside themselves. In the ruins of Cologne, a war correspondent recorded a scene that haunted him for years. A wounded German youth, barely 17, being treated by an American medic. The boy's face was pale, his uniform torn. The medic worked silently, methodically, with the same care he would give his own comrade. Around them lay the debris of civilization, church bells broken, books scattered in the mud, walls scarred by fire. The correspondent wrote, "In that silence, it felt as though the war had stopped for a moment, not because the guns ceased, but because compassion had returned." After the war, many of these medics received no recognition, no medals, and most never spoke of what they had done. Yet historians and archivists who uncovered their reports found in them something that statistics could never capture: the persistence of morality under impossible circumstances. It was not universal, not constant, but it existed, quietly defying the logic of hate. The soldiers who shared their medical kits with their enemies did not see themselves as saints. They were tired, frightened, and human. They acted out of something ancient, an instinct that even on the battlefield, life still mattered. The cold forests of Europe and the shattered cities bore witness to that truth. It was said that when mercy appears amid ruins, it does not erase the horror, it only proves that humanity has not completely vanished. And perhaps that was the real victory. No one could have imagined how long the echoes of those moments would last. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world tried to rebuild itself. Cities, borders, families, entire systems of belief. Yet for the soldiers who had lived through it, peace did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, in fragments, often haunted by memories that did not fit the official narrative of victory. The men who had once crawled through mud to save a wounded enemy rarely spoke of it. To many, those acts seemed out of place in a story of conquest and liberation. But for them, those brief encounters between enemies, between strangers, carried more weight than any medal or commendation. They had seen the edge of what humanity could endure and had chosen, even for a heartbeat, to step back from the abyss. In the years that followed, historians began collecting testimonies from medics, infantrymen, and chaplains. The stories emerged slowly, often told in old age, when time had softened the fear of judgment. One former combat medic recalled treating a wounded German in France using the last vial of morphine in his pouch. He had been reprimanded by his commanding officer, who reminded him that supplies were meant for their own men. But decades later, when asked if he regretted it, he simply said, "No, that was the only thing I did in the war that made sense." Across the Pacific and Europe, similar confessions appeared in interviews, letters, and memoirs. They were not tales of glory. They were accounts of moral exhaustion, of people trying to hold on to the last thread of decency in a world collapsing around them. Many veterans described how, at the time, they did not think in moral terms. It was not about mercy or forgiveness or redemption. It was about instinct, a refusal to become what the war demanded them to be. Some historians later framed these moments as small acts of rebellion against the machinery of dehumanization. The modern battlefield had turned killing into procedure, suffering into statistics. To stop, to kneel beside a wounded man who wore the wrong uniform, was to momentarily break that mechanism. It was a quiet protest, not against one's own country, but against the idea that compassion had no place in war. In the post-war years, as the world divided again into new rivalries and fears, the memory of shared humanity became politically inconvenient. Official history spoke of courage and sacrifice, but rarely of mercy toward the enemy. Only in private conversations did these episodes resurface at reunions, in veterans' hospitals, in letters never meant for publication. One former Army nurse who served in Italy described treating both Allied and Axis prisoners in the same field hospital. She wrote, "We were told to prioritize our own, but when the stretcher arrived, I could never see the difference. The wounds looked the same. The blood had the same color." Her words were simple, stripped of sentiment, yet they captured the essence of something larger, the universal sameness of human suffering. For many who had been there, these memories blurred the lines of identity. Some veterans admitted that after the war they struggled to hate anyone, even those they had once fought. They had seen too much pain to believe in pure enemies. Others, however, carried guilt not for what they had done, but for what they had not been able to do. The helplessness of leaving men to die, simply because there were not enough supplies or time, stayed with them longer than any battlefield wound. In documentaries and oral histories recorded decades later, researchers noted a pattern. When veterans spoke of battle, their voices grew distant. When they spoke of saving someone, even an enemy, their tone changed. They remembered the faces, the eyes, the trembling hands. Some could still recall the smell of disinfectant, the sound of breathing slowing down, the weight of a man on a stretcher. Memory preserved those fragments as if they were proof that something human had survived inside them. In the 1,970 seconds, when archival footage from the Pacific and European campaigns was restored, new generations saw these acts for the first time. The images, grainy, unpolished, showed medics and infantrymen working side by side over wounded prisoners. There were no speeches, no triumph, only gestures, careful, precise, deliberate. For historians, these clips became a reminder that the story of war is never complete when told only through strategy and victory. It is also written in the quiet moments when compassion crosses enemy lines. Psychologists who studied post-war trauma noted that for many veterans, remembering those small acts of mercy became a form of healing. It gave meaning to the chaos, a point of light amid endless destruction. It reminded them that, for all the horror they had witnessed, they had not lost everything. They had not become the thing they feared most: unfeeling, indifferent, mechanical. In 1995, at a memorial service in Honolulu, a retired medic was asked to speak about his experience on a Pacific island 50 years earlier. He did not talk about combat or strategy. Instead, he described the moment he shared his last bandage with a wounded enemy soldier. The crowd listened in silence. "It wasn't about forgiveness," he said. "It was about not forgetting that I was human." The audience stood and applauded, not for heroism, but for honesty. Today, historians and filmmakers still debate how to define such moments. Were they compassion, duty, or simply a reaction to unbearable suffering? The answer may never be clear. What matters is that they happened repeatedly, quietly, and against all odds. They proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, some refuse to let darkness win completely. When future generations watch those restored films or read those yellowed letters, they see something beyond uniforms and flags. They see the possibility of decency surviving inside the machinery of destruction. The story of the soldiers who shared their medical kits with wounded enemies is not a story of war at all. It is a story of what war failed to destroy. Because, in the end, mercy did not end the conflict, nor change its outcome, but it changed the people who gave it, and perhaps, in some quiet way, it changed the world that came after.